Welcome into Future Fit Leaders. I'm Zane, Inglis, founder and CEO of Enhance, your trusted partner for change management, leadership, sales growth, and AI solutions.
And I'm Ryan Sheppard, Japan headhunter and author of Sell Yourself Like a CEO.
So thanks for joining us again, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about a really important topic that's not always the easiest skill or attribute to acquire. That's empathy. So Ryan, straight off the bat, what is it about empathy that you think is so vital to an aspiring leader or a current leader becoming a fully fledged future fit leader?
Empathy. It's such a good one because it's such an authentic behavior to develop. I call it a behavior because it's something that, the word empathy is thrown around so much these days, right? But if we're telling ourselves to be empathetic on command, it's kind of defeating the purpose, because empathy is about connection. It's about understanding people and about human connection. And that really starts with a genuine curiosity to want to understand people, to want to care, not just for the sake of accomplishing one's own objective, but it's really that humility, that humbleness that great leaders have, where they're able to take themselves out of the equation and think about what's best for the other person. And that requires to be able to put oneself in someone else's shoes and really feel what they're feeling, so that you can, golden rule, treat others as you'd want them to treat you, do the right thing. And so much of that, I think, is really driven in curiosity, but it's a genuine thing. It can't just be on demand. It's something we need to practice every single day.
It's an interesting one for me, because I think there are certain attributes or behaviors that can be learnt, and others are either DNA, you're born with them, or you acquire them at a very young age, or perhaps they require you to be in an environment that nurtures them. That said, I do think an awareness of the impact empathy has in being a successful leader that your team naturally follow and trust and want to be a part of an organization you're leading. You can do it, but I think it's really important to understand why it's important, and then some techniques about how you can go about applying it if it's maybe not necessarily your greatest attribute in the world. So what are some of the reasons you think empathy is actually important as a leader? What could it enable them to do that if they lack empathy, they may not be able to?
Yeah, well, let's take a step back for a moment and let's think about the last 5 years. 5 years ago, right now, was May 2020. We were being thrust into COVID. The stock market was crashing. Companies were not hiring, downsizing, and it was just absolute chaos. And uncertainty was at an all-time high, in my opinion. I had never experienced such uncertainty in my whole life. Perhaps the Lehman shock of 2008 comes close, but COVID was an entirely different animal. Then we had and unfortunately still have, the Russia-Ukraine war, which thrust even more uncertainty into the equation. Then we have inflation, cost-cutting, agile restructuring. Now we've got tariffs. So uncertainty is the new normal. And perhaps, technology is only going to speed up uncertainty as well, and how all these dynamics can affect each other. So what that means is that as a leader, as future fit leaders, we need to have the empathy to be able to understand how these external circumstances are affecting other people in our team, in our organization, our family, even ourselves, to empathize with ourselves, that it's okay not to be okay. Some days are really bad or low days. It could be a combination of weather and news or this or that, or we get a shocking email. So to really be in touch with oneself and the people around us, so that when it comes down to making difficult decisions, like letting people go, or having to, being required by a company to make a difficult decision that you don't agree with, but you have to carry it out. Then in those situations, empathy is absolutely key. And a number of pharmaceutical CEOs, for example, in Japan, that has been going through a number of major downsizings, the best reputation that I've heard have been of the leaders who have been empathetic during that time.
I think the most extreme examples I probably could give related to that would be after the Kanto earthquake. or Tohoku earthquake, and the day the earthquake actually happened, while it was still going on, I've heard of CEOs who literally got in their car, drove to Narita Airport, left their car there, and never came back to Japan because they were so, worried about what was going on, particularly due to Fukushima. But the CEO of Air New Zealand at the time, a guy called Rob Fife, he actually got on the plane and flew, over to Japan to support his team through that. So that's a really extreme example of showing that you care. And I think often there's a large disconnect between leaders of organizations, particularly when you're an owner or a CEO, that you seem in such a faraway land from the average person, finding it out on the ground. And I remember, sitting back as a 17, 18-year-old in one of my first jobs, looking at my boss, driving a brand new Mitsubishi Prado 4-wheel drive, and thinking, man, I'm working my butt off here just to give that guy a new car. But in reality, I never considered the fact that he had, goodness knows how much debt and how much invested in stock, being a company that sold architectural hardware. I couldn't put myself in his shoes to understand that maybe that car was his one thing that made his life bearable. And likewise, maybe he could have shared that with us, or he could have, built that relationship, because we were an organization, I guess, of 20 people at the time, but the distance between us was so great. So I think empathy is a really great tool for you to bridge that gap, particularly when you're getting into an organization of hundreds, if not thousands of people.
Yeah, and it goes for every single profession. On one end of the spectrum, we have sales, right? Making sales, creating revenue. And for someone not in sales, it's a really scary thing. But the natural salespeople out there, they do one thing really well, and that's empathizing with their customer, asking just a few questions, just to really get to the heart of what someone really needs and why and what it means to them, so they can translate a feature into a benefit for that person. But that's not just sales, that's influence. And even on the other end of the spectrum, someone like an accountant, for an example, who's crunching numbers all the time, it's easy to fall into habits like asking a partner for a discount. Can you give me a discount? Right? But even sending that message requires empathy, because if we value a partnership, just like we value someone and a service that they've done for us, how we ask for that discount in a way that enriches the relationship and isn't just a blunt, transactional, top-down demand, that carries a lot of power and influence as well. And in a world where we're so interconnected with different products and services, software as a service, applications, vendors, etc., how we communicate to each other, each communication is an opportunity to demonstrate empathy and to make the most out of partnerships, whether that's internal or external, or in employment, or relationships in and outside of business.
So in other words, it's a key tool to build trust, understanding, rapport. And an example of sales, when I see so many sales representatives trying to sell something to a new client, they just rush straight in and start pushing the product and the features on the client without taking a step back and understanding their current situation. So, for example, I will always encourage them to do a bit of research and find out, is this company growing? Is it flat, or is it in decline? If that company's in decline, or they've had a huge product recall, the chances are the person you're talking to is not having a great day. Asking them how their business is going and how it's impacting them, to see if they're in a physical mind state to consider a new option. And just showing that empathy will often be a big point of difference between you and a competitor, rather than just forcing something down someone. And the same goes for a leader. Before you impose your will or your vision on someone, how are they feeling? How are they, what's their mindset? And that way you can tailor the message to suit them and make it easier to receive for the person on the other side of the table.
Yeah, exactly. It loops back to self-awareness, one of the other traits we were talking about the other day, being aware of how your actions affect other people.
And I guess the key technique that you already started to touch on was questioning, and linked to that is curiosity, understanding what questions to ask, and having a curious mind to, dig for the hidden messages, or perhaps in many cases, the person you're trying to communicate with doesn't have the self-awareness to really understand the situation for themselves. So by you probing and asking the right question and being empathetic, you can actually help them consolidate their own thoughts and maybe feel a little bit more comfortable, or in some cases maybe less comfortable, but recognizing the need for change or the need to embrace a new idea.
Yeah, questions are so powerful, and the information that we get is only as good as the questions we ask. So my job is to ask questions, both to candidates and clients. And a great framework that I use to keep myself grounded and to frame each question so that it really puts the customer in the spotlight, not me, is who, what, why, when, where, how. So what are your long-term career goals? Why are you thinking about the next step now? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? So as long as the questions start with who, what, why, when, where, how, we're probing and giving the stage to the other person to then share their thoughts and feelings, which is all the information that we need, whether we're a headhunter or career coach or a consultant to a client, or we're a president, or we're talking to our son about what he needs to be successful in his studies. All of those require questionings to understand the other person. And the way to do that is making sure questions are driven by curiosity and start with a who, what, why, when, where, how, or tell me, explain to me, describe to me, TED. Tell me about the culture of your company, or describe to me what your ideal situation looks like in a year, or explain to me what motivated you to make this decision. Then that can give us the insights to really truly understand people, and then be able to, then it becomes clear how we can help.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful questions to ask yourself, and also ask the person you're talking to, is the why. If we go back to, for those of us who've got kids, when your kid's about 3 years old, everything that you ask them to do, or everything they see, they're always asking why. People are naturally wanting to understand the context if they need to do something different, or you're asking them to take up a new role. The why is really giving them the context of what's in it for them, or how it impacts them. So before you deliver a message, putting yourself in that person's perspective and think, what's the why question that they would want to know, and how could I explain this that answers that why question without them having to actually ask me that? So that shows that you've put some thought into it. You've put yourself in their shoes, which will help them buy into whatever it is you're trying to sell.
Yeah, it can also be, there's also a nuance in there. So for example, why did you decide to leave this company, or why are you looking for a new job, is a question that can automatically make someone feel defensive, like they have to defend the reason why they're wanting to leave that company. But if we convert that into a what's motivating you to, or what's triggered you to think about, or what attracted you to, then that's a really subtle, empathetic shift in questioning that I've learned over the years, where, yeah, I want to know, like, why are you thinking to leave your company? It's only been 2 years. We want to be seeing people in companies 3 to 5 years, give or take. But saying what, starting with what, makes it less a personal interrogation, but more of a discussion. So I think really a key thing with empathy is, as well, especially in managing low performers or some sort of dispute or conflict, is not seeing the person as the problem, but discussing with the person about that problem objectively, and together pointing at that issue or problem instead of pointing at each other.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think another key point to your reference here to delivery is your facial expressions. The amount of times people believe they're genuinely giving, or coaching in my terms is where you have the person evaluate themselves before you give them the answer. But with the look on your face or the tone of your voice, you're already telling them, I'm not happy with what you're delivering here. That's not showing much empathy as well. Another key thing I see is when you're a leader looking at behavioral issues, that sometimes it can be quite difficult to comprehend, why does someone continue to do this? Because you yourself would never do that. It's incomprehensible. But an example would be working with a company maybe 2 or 3 years ago. they had an employee who was very much in other people's personal spaces. They were quite loud. They weren't overly polite, and particularly in Japan, this is something that's really challenging um, for people to comprehend. But they didn't take the time to really figure out what the issues were with the behavior. They just told the person to stop it, and it continued. So I suggested having a conversation and finding out, are you aware that you do this, and where do you think that came from, and understanding a little bit about the person's background. And it turned out that the person's parents were kind of hands off. They grew up with a group of other kids who were like that, so they were quite loud and brash, and no one ever kind of told them it wasn't the way to go. And their first job was working in the alcohol industry, where they had to go and sell alcohol to nightclub owners and so forth. That was part of the job, was being loud and brash and being very, very friendly. And then all of a sudden, working in a luxury brand where it's not acceptable, that person hadn't been able to recognize that behavior wasn't acceptable. So once you get curious enough and show a bit of empathy to understand the cause of behavior, then it's a lot easier to help that person comprehend why it is you're not so happy with it, rather than just telling them based on your own preconceptions or your own life experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in this fast-moving day and age, we all can benefit from just a moment to slow down and self-reflect and self-examine as well. And so recognizing that, someone else might be rushing through their day and not have had that chance to slow down. And we remind ourselves we're all human. It's not like this is a bad person. It's just maybe a bad moment. And let's take a step back together and, see how I can help this person out of the moment.
Have you ever come across any books that provided you interesting hints into empathy, or perhaps how to improve it?
Yeah, this just came to my mind actually. There's a book called Multipliers, and it's how to be a multiplier rather than a diminisher. So how to raise people up, then put them down. And the key kind of habit in there that I took away from the book was giving someone an imaginary hero label in your head. So I remember in my workshop for this, I labeled someone as the eagle, because they're always looking at something from a bird's eye view and seeing the bigger picture, and they're demonstrating the empathy to consider different people in the equation and what different sides might be thinking in that particular situation. So I found that really helpful, that, okay, starting with maybe a few people that frustrate me, how can I look at them for the hero that they are? What are they really good at? And how can I kind of put an imaginary label on them in my head, right? To be able to see them through a positive lens than what my interactions with them have conditioned me to think of them through perhaps some intense exchanges or whatever. So Multipliers, it's a great book. And one of the ways is just giving someone an imaginary label to see them for the hero that they are.
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually. I can see a few leaders I've worked with in the past who I can see as eagles, who've got a very top-line view. They have a broad view, but they struggle to perhaps see the little intricacies of what's going on the day-to-day basis. One of the techniques I use quite a bit as a coach dealing with CEOs who often struggle to really empathize with the people 2, 3, 4 levels below them in the organization is to consider how many people within your organization actually aspire to have your role as CEO. So, for example, say we have a 500-person organization, and I can clearly remember one specific CEO saying, probably around 10. I said, okay, how many of them do you think actually aspire to have your role for the right reasons, not just for the salary and recognition? And he had to sit back and think for a little bit. And he said, in that case, probably 5. And I said, okay, of those 5, how many actually have the potential to develop the skills, the knowledge, and the experience you need to deliver in this role? And his head dropped down and he said, probably 1 if I'm lucky. I said, so you have one person in this organization who probably thinks like you, is driven and, is motivated by the things that you're motivated by, yet you're delivering the message to that one person the same way you're delivering it to the other 499, and they probably can't comprehend where you're coming from. So
Yeah.
trying to put yourself in those who are not similar to you, into their shoes, and think about it from a very different perspective is something that's very important for CEOs, because generally they're very driven and very smart, and they assume what they're capable of doing is, it's second nature, it's easy. But in reality, it is rocket science in many cases for their employees.
Yeah, and it's such a hard thing to do, to not compare other people to ourselves. And, I see that behavior with CEOs that I work with as well, and not just CEOs, but senior level decision makers. They're looking for someone that reminds them of themselves, right? But be able to recognize potential in someone who doesn't remind us of ourselves. Like, we don't really have the built-in roadmap for predicting if that person's going to be successful. It's scary. It's uncomfortable. It's risky, right? To think outside of the box. And that's why I think there's a lot of missed talent out there, because that person's just not showing up in that 30-minute interview in a way that reminds the person of themselves. So it goes back to a superpower that I think job seekers can take away for anyone watching this who is seeking a new opportunity right now, or who might in the future, which is pretty much any adult. And that is, before an interview, really try to see how you can empathize with the interviewer that you're about to be meeting. Who are they? What's their background? Identify a couple of common points. And if you can, somehow know a little bit about what the business challenge that they're facing is. If you don't know, you can just ask these things in an interview, and make sure to keep your answers concise and specific, so that there's enough time for you to ask some questions, so you can demonstrate curiosity, empathize with them, and then there might just be one or two things more that stand out to you there that make you all the better fit for the role, or that you think, "Oh, I'm glad I asked that, because I'm not sure about this. I'm not getting the right taste in my mouth from this conversation." Empathy. It's a superpower.
I'm going to finish off today from my perspective with a personal example of something I did that significantly increased my empathy, particularly towards my team members. Was taking a personality test called Honey and Mumford's Learning Styles. It kind of looks at how people respond to change or new things, or how they go about learning. And at the time, I had a very senior guy working in my team. He was probably 20 years older than me. He'd come from a very famous organization. But often when I'd ask him to do something, he would hesitate. And I was thinking it was because he was lazy, or he just couldn't be bothered. But when I took that test for myself as part of a training program that I'd actually been through, I realized that he was a completely different personality type, and there were specific reasons for his reaction. And in a lot of ways, there were strengths. He was very detail orientated. He didn't want to make mistakes, so he didn't want to be forced to do something without preparation. And that one test really gave me a clear aha moment that I was trying to lead him to be a clone of myself, or expecting him to be a clone of me and think the same way. And by being aware of that, I could adjust my communication style and give him plenty of time to prepare for the things I wanted him to do. And he willingly did them. So personality tests, you've mentioned a couple of them in the past as well, that can often, with a group of people you're working with, help you understand each other's personal traits and styles, so you recognize the strengths and potentially the development opportunities. Thanks again for everyone joining today. Like always, we'd love to get your feedback on what part of this discussion you really empathize with and what you might like to try. So hit us with your feedback in the comments, or drop us a line on LinkedIn.
Yes, if you're still watching this, it means that you found something valuable in our content, and we would love to know what that is. So please go ahead and just drop one comment into the comments. What was the one thing that you took away from today that you're going to implement in your own life? Would love to know what you got out of today's episode.